Good afternoon, and welcome back to the second part of today's workshop towards sustainable homes and neighbourhoods in the Mediterranean region, reflecting on Malta's potential. Mr. Mark Darder, Chief of the Technical Cabinet at the Regional Ministry for Territory and Sustainability, Catalonia, Spain, will be moderating the second session, where we will be discussing a rights-based approach to affordable housing programs and land use. Mr. Darder, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah Lee. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very clearly, thank you.
Okay, perfect. So, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to moderate this very interesting session. I would like to thank the Ministry for Social Accommodation in Malta and the rest of the co-organizers of this very interesting session for giving me the privilege to do this moderation. I think we have a very, very interesting panel ahead of us. And I would like to just do some few comments on the topic before starting in order to make a kind of introduction. So if you allow me, I would like to start with the section 26th of the Statute of Autonomy of Catalonia, where I come from, which states what it follows. People who do not have sufficient resources are entitled to access to decent housing, for which the public authorities must establish by law a system of measures guaranteeing this right, with the conditions determined by law. We all agree that housing is a fundamental right, granted in some constitutions of countries, but at the same time is a financial asset, especially in a globalized world, where great investment funds base their financial model on real estate market. Sometimes public institutions have neither the power nor the legal backup to overcome this huge market pushed by mass tourism, gentrification, or speculative purposes. Okay, this is the bad news first. Regulation alone will not save the problem of housing. Somebody said before that there's no silver bullet to resolve this situation. And at the first sight, we can list several limitations. First of all, governance. All levels of government are involved in housing policies. And sometimes, far from being an advantage, this fact becomes a ballast, since the ideological and political game distorts the possibility of according and implementing real, synchronized, and coherent solutions. Secondly, we have a lack of technical expertise sometimes. We build our dwellings in a slow, expensive, and unsustainable way, disregarding the informal settlements, which are a real problem in many countries. The construction sectors are very conservative, and usually profit-driven oriented. Housing should be done in the fastest, cheapest, and sustainable way, involving prefabrication, sustainable, and reused materials. The sector is hardly innovative and digital. Financing public housing stocks are in general insufficient and sometimes inadequate for satisfying all kinds of lifestyles: aging, migration needs, homelessness, vulnerability, mixed communities, and etc., etc. We have to demand as well, we have to ask for environmental responsibility. We must claim for environmental responsibility of housing and public housing as well. Climate neutral housing, renewable energies implementation, energy efficiency. Not only the social dimension of housing should be attended, but the environmental sustainability is a pillar that must guide public policies for the future years. And finally, planning. Housing shapes cities, since according to UN Habitat, around 70% of our cities are made by dwellings. Since 2002, in Catalonia, by law, in planning areas, up to 30% of land must be built by social housing. Likewise, this percentage is mandatory in residential developments within the existing fabric of the city of Barcelona, as Mr. Buron has pointed out previously in the previous session. But a planning system which is based in zoning and is based on increasing the land use and expanding the boundaries of the urban areas is not useful in a context where urban renovation is getting paramount due to the lack of demographic growth expectancy. But there's a silver lining here though. The good news is that we have excellent speakers with us that will try to explain their experiences in housing policies, especially on planning and regulatory frameworks. And first of all, let me give the floor to Mr. Kurt Sherry, who's the legal housing and policy expert from the Ministry for Social Accommodation and Housing Authority. Kurt, you have 10 minutes. Please, if you are so kind, please stick to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark, for your very kind introduction. I also join the rest of the participants in thanking the Honourable Galdes for organising this event and his team, who I know have been working incessantly for the past few days in order to make this possible, so a heartfelt thanks. My intervention today ties in very, very well with the first panel in that, as underlined by Mark, I mean, when studying housing, the main dualism which we must consider is whether to consider housing as a social good or as to treat it primarily as an asset. My presentation today is meant to demonstrate perhaps how mainstream ideology has also found its way, has formalized its expression in law, so to speak. And whilst laws themselves give substance and enforce the right to housing, there are other laws which might perhaps impede the full realization of this right to housing, in that they may produce certain obstacles. Let's start first of all with the situation as it is here in Malta, but the situation is very much relatable to the rest of the world. We have the, let's say, the neoliberal politics which have found their full and most loyal expression here in Malta until a few years ago. So basically we had the transfer of responsibility for housing provision, which was shifted entirely onto the market, the view that home ownership was the solution for all, but obviously this was not the case. Not everyone could become a homeowner, but in the meantime, there was a reduction in public housing, especially in spending in new public housing units, and tenant protection legislation being revised in favor of more liberalization. So we had a process which, let's say, suited a great part of the population, but not all of it. And as Rachel described in her previous intervention, the economic boom which Malta went through until and it is still going through well, or until the outbreak of the pandemic, tested, let's say, the limits of this reliance on the market. So we've been feeling the pressure to have an enforced right to housing here in Malta. Now, we have solutions already proposed. So to the problems posed by this neoliberal system, having a 10-year neutral housing policy, therefore a housing policy which also promotes rentals as well as home ownership, and of course greater investment in social rented housing. Of course, everything is inspired by the fact that housing should be treated primarily as a social good as opposed to a commodified or a financialized asset. But may the state regulate the private rented sector as it wants, and may the state build social housing at will? This is the first question. Second one is, if we were to treat housing as a social good, to what extent is it reflected in legislation? So, for example, previous speakers said, Susanna Bauer, for example, housing is a human right. Okay, but how is it expressed in legislation? So the first part of the presentation will deal with presenting more or less which are the main instruments which deal with housing as a fundamental human right. And there's a variety of instruments. We'll go through them very, very quickly. It's not the aim of this presentation to provide an exhaustive illustration of the right to housing, but we may take examples which show us how the right to housing is enforced in law. So generally we have, but not in every country, systems which provide for the right to housing in their own constitutions. One example is, for example, South Africa, Article 26, everyone has the right to have access to adequate housing. And this article was enforced in the famous Grootboom and others case, which was decided in 2000, where the highest court of South Africa decided that the state, on the basis of this article, did have the obligation to devise, fund, implement, and supervise measures to provide relief to those in desperate need. So we can see here how effectively a right contained in the Constitution was putting pressure on the state to continue and to sustain its investment in public housing. We also have the example of France. It was already very well described by our French colleagues earlier, but France successfully introduced an article, or rather a whole set of laws, with the aim of making the right to housing a reality. Therefore, with the main aim, therefore, of putting pressure through the laws on the state in order to drive the construction of suitable and affordable housing. And a case which showed how effective this tool, this instrument was, is the case of Chacontio Happy, which was decided by the European Court of Human Rights, where in this case a French applicant had successfully had her argument upheld before the French court. The French state, however, held that it did not have the sufficient funds to rehouse her and to provide accommodation, and the Court of Human Rights said, no, this is a violation of Article 6, because if the state is bound by law to provide accommodation, then it cannot simply say that it does not have the necessary funds to do so. Now, other international instruments, one of the first to let's say, proclaim a right to adequate housing was the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. But perhaps the instrument which asserts this more strongly is the European Social Charter. We had the case, for example, of the international movement ATD versus France, where in this case, the Social Committee, the Committee for Social Rights, declared that there was a clear shortage of social housing in France for the poorest people, and people were being kept waiting for a very long time, and this obviously produced a violation. There's also the European Convention on Human Rights and the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights itself. So we can see in this first part of the presentation how there is a drive towards the achievement of the right to housing through various instruments. However, we can see that there are certain obstacles on the way. There are opposing currents which are forming to the right to housing being considered in a more universalistic, if you want, way. And the first one is the European Court of Human Rights itself, which has been giving greater weight to the right to property in cases concerning tenancy law. At first, until the 80s and 90s, into the early 2000s, the court was adamant. It used to say it was open to the legislature to take any kind of measure affecting housing. But this interpretation changed in Hutchinson in 2006, and the court held that if the rental amount is excessively low, then it can impair the very essence of the applicant's right to property. It also pronounced the entitlement to derive profit from the landlord's property. So therefore, an entitlement to derive profit became a fundamental human right. This was further asserted in the cases dealing with Malta, where the European Court here said that the state couldn't shift most of the social and financial costs of supplying housing accommodation, understood as social housing, onto the private parties. So what is interesting here is not so much the effects of this case, because as we will see in the following slide, in reality, rent control measures in Malta here were extremely strict on landlords, but it's the proclamation of a principle. It's the proclamation that there is an entitlement to profit, and possibly raising an ideological statement to the highest level of law, which is that of a fundamental human right. Another example we found of resistance to, let's say, a very ambitious housing policy is that of competition law. And under European laws, it's interesting to note that under 34.3 of the Charter, there is a right to social and housing assistance, but there is no explicit policy on social housing. And we can see how certain countries such as Sweden and the Netherlands, which are known for their broad models of non-profit housing, have had to rethink their models on the basis of the restrictions imposed by competition law. We have, of course, the most famous case here by the Commission against the Netherlands, where it held that provision of social housing may qualify as service of general economic interest if it is restricted to a target group of disadvantaged citizens or socially less advantaged groups, meaning that if social housing was built, then it must be targeted towards that specific group. It couldn't be applied, let's say, liberally to the middle classes. In reality, the compromise found by the Netherlands, and which also was accepted by the Commission, was that there would be a capping for applicants at a maximum income of 33,000 euros. Meaning that, when we translate this into figures, it means that up to 43% of the population were eligible for social housing. So in reality, we can see that the effect was not so drastic, but we find the reiteration of principles of neoliberal assumptions finding their way not only in literature, but also in law. Of course, this is raising questions all over, because obviously, this will lead now to concentrations of lower-income households into the social rented sector, something which countries such as Sweden and the Netherlands were avoiding up to a certain point. And also the second question, which is that who is going to provide affordable rented dwellings for the middle-income households if the state cannot do it and if the private market is not interested in doing it. So same effects in Sweden, in fact, without going into too much detail, but basically the municipal housing companies had to also adapt to operating in a business-like way. But the main question for us as a Southern European nation, which have a residualized social housing sector, is we were looking at countries such as the Netherlands and such as Sweden, looking up to them and developing perhaps a broader definition of social housing, but is European law permitting this? In fact, the question being asked by Elsinga and Lind is, are both countries, Sweden and the Netherlands, moving towards a dual rental model, a safety net outside the market at below market rent? So is the system making the Dutch and Swedish system more similar to ours rather than the other way around? And it has also been commented that this interpretation does not fit the universe of social housing, does not fit the universalistic model in these countries, and that we need to discuss in general across the entire European Union how to define social housing and finding a notion which is common to all of us and which allows the state perhaps a bit more freedom in implementing its plans. So we said before that there is a right to housing, but we can see how therefore there is also a resisting current which does not allow the state to legislate in these areas as it wants. So it's become much more difficult now to assess the state's margin of appreciation. So basically, in summary of what we've said, there is the constitutional or let's say a human right to housing, but it is being limited by certain interpretations of the European Court of Human Rights in the field of rent control and of rent regulation, and also by competition law. My final slide being that these are examples where perhaps mainstream ideology is no longer constricting housing understood as a social good politically, but it is now also doing it legally. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kurt. It's been a very clear presentation about how, which are exactly this short margin of appreciation that you were talking about, how difficult it is for the countries and the different levels of governance to try to express this fundamental right, human right, which is housing, into laws. So thank you very much for your statement. And I think we will move to the next speaker, the next panelist, which is Ms. Lisa Bullen. She's from the Scottish Government's Affordable Housing Programme, Housing Needs Demand Assessment Process and Social Housing Investment Plans of Scotland. I think we have Lisa with us. Lisa, are you there?
Hello.
Hello.
I hope you can hear me.
Sure. Perfect.
I'll just start my presentation. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a real privilege to be with you today. Today I'm going to talk briefly about the housing planning framework that we use in Scotland to support the planning and delivery of affordable housing. We have evolved this system over a period of some 20 years and have found it to be effective in integrating needs-based housing with affordable housing investment and local housing delivery. That's not to say it's perfect or can't be improved, but it has and is delivering. In recent years, investment in affordable homes in Scotland has been significant. We've had a target, first of all, for 30,000 affordable homes over a 5-year period. And more recently, in the current period, we have a target for 50,000 affordable homes supported by £3.5 billion of funding. The first target we exceeded by 10%, and we are on track to meet, or we were on track to meet the 50,000. But due to the pandemic, this has been impacted, but we will commit to deliver that as when it is safe to do so. The numbers are important. However, we've held a strong belief for a significant time in Scotland that when it comes to delivery, what matters is ensuring the right homes in the right places. And I think this chimes with lots of what I've been hearing today about mixed tenure, mix of type of housing, and sustainable neighbourhoods. This is a key purpose of our framework, to identify the projects that will deliver against assessed local priorities. The first slide here is a slightly simplified version of our framework. It shows the functions at the national level in orange and those at local authority in blue and green. You'll see that it's a strong focus on the local level, and this is because we believe that place-based approaches are key to effective housing planning and delivery. It's worth mentioning that in Scotland we have 32 local authorities, and that these vary from large cities to rural authorities and even island authorities. So it's very much that one approach, one system wouldn't suit all areas. I'd like to draw your attention to the top boxes in orange. This represents the role of the Scottish Government at a national level. As housing is a devolved function from the UK Government, we are responsible in Scotland for all aspects of housing. Our role is to set national policy and guidance and to manage the national investment, including the Affordable Housing Supply Programme. With the exception of 2 local authorities who do have management responsibility for that, it is a single programme managed centrally by Scottish Government. Moving down into the green boxes, the green and blue boxes, this shows the function of the local authority. The green being housing functions, in dotted red lines I will speak a little bit more about today. That's the local housing strategy process. The easiest way to describe this is that the local housing strategy is the strategic plan, the housing need and demand analysis, the evidence that supports it, while the strategic housing investment plan is the operational plan to inform the delivery of affordable housing. The blue boxes relate to local authority planning functions. I don't want to say much about this other than to draw your attention to it and to emphasise how important this link is. We think it's important that the evidence base informs both housing and planning, and that they have a shared view about priorities for housing delivery. We also think it's important that we are joined up with our planning colleagues at national level on spatial strategy and policy. We expect local authorities to align these functions locally and to bring forward their plans together. This means that each local authority is able to decide when it will take forward its local housing strategy, rather than it being nationally set timescales. This is to ensure alignment with plans locally. Just moving on to my second slide here. So local housing strategies were introduced by the 2001 Housing Scotland Act. The legislation made clear that local authorities are the strategic housing authority and therefore responsible for housing within their area. This includes the requirement to produce a local housing strategy supported by an assessment of housing need and demand, setting out local authority strategy, priorities and plans for the delivery of housing and related services. Local authorities are expected to produce their strategies every 5 years and to cover all aspects of the housing system, including current and future need for housing, different tenures, homelessness, housing affordability, quality, condition. In the development strategies, local authorities are required to fully consider equalities issues and other disciplines such as health, social work and planning, and ensure full consultation. All local housing strategies are submitted to Scottish Government and undergo a peer review process involving Scottish Government and colleagues from another local authority. The local housing strategy should be informed by a housing need and demand assessment that considers the main housing market drivers, the profile of housing stock, future housing estimates, as well as the need for specialist provision. As the estimates from this process will inform land supply, particularly where and how much, the figures can be of significant interest as well, of course, as dispute. To bring transparency and consistency to this process, we have developed a national methodology and approach to allow local authorities to use this collaboratively locally. This methodology includes a housing need and demand assessment tool, which is an Excel-based tool to help undertake calculations using the best available data, but allowing flexibility to change assumptions and scenarios locally. It allows the user to output estimates based on household projections, on need, and to consider issues of affordability and likely tenure requirements under different economic scenarios. Once complete, a housing needs and demand assessment will be submitted to Scottish Government and assessed by analysts to ensure that the work can be signed off as being robust and credible. This has helped to build confidence in both the approach and the work of local authorities. Moving to the next slide. The last part of the housing planning framework is the Strategic Housing Investment Plan. These are very much operational and delivery focused documents. They should be informed by the objectives and priorities of the local housing strategy and be delivered in collaboration locally. They're produced annually and look forward 5 years. Projects will likely be more formed in the early years. So years 1 to 3, we're more likely to have more projects and to be able to identify the details of those. In the later years, these are clearly less defined. But we think it's good practice to include this forward look as it encourages better strategic planning and an ability to tackle longer term, more complex problems. The SHIP is a good test of the local authority's ability to deliver and the partnerships that have in place to support that. The Scottish Government provides local authority with resource planning assumptions which act as a guide to how much funding they may receive. This is not an allocation, so if local authorities are unable to deliver, funding could be moved. Equally, if local authorities are demonstrating good delivery, then they could benefit from affordable and additional funds. This way, we can operate the affordable housing programme to maximise spend against strategic priorities. That's all I wanted to say today, and I hope that that's been helpful.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for this very, very clear presentation. Plenty of really good insights. Let me say that you are like solving some of the problems that I was pointing out in the beginning of my introduction about, for instance, co-governance. I think I understand that your system is a kind of a collaborative system. It's based on governance and co-governance and confidence, which I think is a very good approach, and emphasizing, of course, the importance of local authorities, no, in this local level based policy that you are doing in Scotland as well. And another, I think, very, very nice insight from your presentation is that you are doing this policy is evidence-based on an evidence-based approach. This need and demand assessment and these strategic housing investment plans, which are undertaken with a relatively short time, with each 5 years period, with a follow-up, with the possibility to add additional funds. I think it's very, very, very interesting. So thank you very much, Lisa. I hope we have some questions for you after panelists. Okay, let's move to our next panelist, which is Mr. Yakubu Haralambos, sorry, from the Cyprus Land Development Corporation, Cyprus. Yakubu, are you here with us?
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Haralambos Yakubu.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
It's
no
impossible for me.
I understand, totally understand. I will share now my screen. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. At the beginning of this presentation, I will briefly present Cyprus Land Development Corporation, and then I will focus on the challenges facing today and our future strategy. And finally, I will explain different approaches about our near future projects. Cyprus Land Development Corporation is a public organization established by Cyprus government in 1990. It is under the responsibility of the Ministry of Interior and it's managed by a 9-member board of directors. Our mission is the implementation of government's housing program to provide affordable residential dwellings to people who have difficulties to acquire through the private sector and meet certain financial criteria. A specific policy is followed throughout the years in order that we can provide affordable housing, such as efficient use of land to reduce the cost of land per unit, reasonable unit size, and efficient use of space, economy of scale because we usually develop large-scale projects, and our margin profit is up to 15%. Since 1980, the organization delivered to beneficiaries 2,100 plus and 2,900 residential units. This is the map of Cyprus. As you can see, we have delivered projects all around the island, rural and urban areas, plots or residential units. Throughout our experience and continuously studying the current needs, especially after the 2013 crisis and now with the pandemic crisis. And we realize that we face a lot of challenges, such as the increased demand of residences, the lack of stock for rent or buying at affordable prices, affordability. There are difficulties to obtain for people to obtain mortgages and difficulties to support their financial obligations. Social cohesion, finding suitable urban land at affordable price, areas with increased social problems, share common spaces that they are not used or they are not maintained properly, maintenance, people have difficulties to meet their obligation, their financial obligation, so they have difficulties to maintain the buildings as well. Looking forward and taking into consideration the challenges we are facing, we decided that we have to act and plan our future strategy based on factors that will help us provide the best possible product for the beneficiaries and the society in general. Every project should be designed and developed based on principles. We have to provide flexibility to users based on their needs and their affordability. Social responsibility, by default, we are a social organization, but we have to move a step forward and add value to the society by providing public spaces and green areas for common use. We have to study and calculate the initial value of a unit compared to the monthly cost of living in that unit. including the transportation, the maintenance, the running cost for energy. We have to apply modern technologies, both in production and product distribution. We have to evaluate and adapt to new society's needs. We have to launch new housing programs. And of course, we have to create healthy communities by mixing people from different backgrounds. Our vision is to develop communities, not just housing projects, based on sustainable development principles with social, economic, and environmental benefits. Uh, Except from the residential use, which is the major use in our project, we will suggest buildings for community services and buildings for job opportunities. Our potential users we will focus on single young people, seniors, single parents, couples, people with special needs, families, and students. We are currently working in order to launch a new affordable rent scheme, which will allow us to provide residential units in affordable rent based on household income, and of course, it will be linked with the minimum salary, with flexibility based on the needs and affordability in an urban environment, and we'll try to avoid developing areas with increased social problems. Our first project will be in Limassol. It will be in a collaboration with the local authority that owns around 31,000 square meters urban land in the city center. So we will provide more than 600 residential units. The first phase, I hope it will start soon for 150 units. 6,000 square meters of community services. These community services should be schools, nursery schools, small shops, banks, or any other services. 70% of the residential units they will be for affordable rents, and 30% of them they will be for selling with mixed users. We will be responsible for the management and the maintenance, and we set a 6 years time frame for the implementation. In Nicosia, we have a different approach, mostly because of land scarcity. So we are in the procedure to buy urban plots spread in the whole city, the whole town. And our first phase will be for 150 residential units, small developments, again with flexibility, mixed users, and the maintenance and management responsibility. So our ambitious project is the development of the new eco-smart communities in the suburban of Nicosia and Limassol, based on eco and smart development models. We will propose a mainly residential community in about 280,000 square meters land in suburbans of Nicosia and 127,000 square meters suburban land in Limassol to provide social and affordable residential units to beneficiaries. The studies are in a collaboration with the University of Cyprus and Department of Architecture, because they want their know-how and their multi-background team. And in order to propose a multidisciplinary approach considering environmental, social, economic aspects related to the current and the future needs. Our target is to enhance social equality, develop new jobs for locals, so they won't have to travel away from that area, to reduce car use and fuel consumption, and develop sustainable units with low maintenance and running costs, reduce emissions, energy consumption and cost, social cohesion and social equality. And we are hoping that this will be a great example for future developments. I think I will briefly present the next two slides, and I will leave you. And this is the pillars of our of the design of these two eco smart cities. The first pillar has to do with social participations and regional connections, with public spaces and streets of multiple activities, and green spaces in order to develop social participation, mixed uses and mixed incomes for the users, land uses that encourage multiple activities, and basic need met within the local area, and they don't have to travel a long way. Supra-local relations within the surrounding communities. The other pillar is the sustainability, mobility, and infrastructure. So energy efficient and low or zero carbon buildings, maximize the use of sustainable energy sources, energy positive community, light traffic lanes, less than 25 kilometers an hour, and pedestrian bicycle routes, utilization of public transports and smart networks, local managers. I think I'm on my time. Housing is a right, not a privilege. Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Haralambus. And sorry for
no, it's okay.
Haralambus.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank
a little
you.
bit.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think it's very interesting to underline that it's not only about doing housing, it's as well about
community.
Yes, to provide communities and to build cities within the cities. No, I mean that's why you are like underlining some key questions, like mixed uses to overcome this ghetto effect, or flexibility, or social responsibility, or even you are talking about green spaces or public spaces as a pillar of a good community. I think it's good to think a little bit about out the box, and think how it's not only about doing housing, is as well doing
living
dwellings
space
and living space. Exactly. So thank you very
Thank
much
you.
for your bright presentation, and let's move to the next panelist, which is Miss Manana Havnaoui. She's the Director General for Planning and Cooperation, Ministry of Equipment, Housing and Territorial Planning in Tunisia. Ms. Manana, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so pleased to be with you. Thank you all for sharing all your experience and ideas. I had really very good ideas from many of the participants. We all share maybe the same challenges. I mean, all our countries share the same challenges, getting decent and affordable houses for everybody. And Tunisia, of course, started, I mean, its housing policy since 1956. And we've been trying ever since to get people living in nice houses, and at the same time having nice cities, like Mark said earlier. But with 2 maybe decades of a very intense public involvement with housing, the 1960s and the 1970s went well. And once people started, and the private sector started to get houses, prices started getting a bit higher. The prices started to get higher, and people couldn't afford their own houses anymore. That's why up to date we have 30% of the housing sector is in informal around the big cities especially, and the public investment is mostly towards the rehabilitation of these neighborhoods, because we cannot just let people living in houses without any kind of facilities of electricity, water, roads, culture centers, stuff like that. So that's why it's not only about getting a roof on the head of everybody, but it's also about getting an upgraded life standards, offering people houses, but near the urban areas where most of job opportunities are available. In Tunisia, 70% of the people are living in urban areas, and that's the most challenge is around the big cities, and especially the capital. And the new strategy of the Tunisian government is not only to build houses, but also to get new tools for urban planning and public transportation, to be able to create maybe new urban areas and get people to have houses in formal, well-planned neighborhoods. And we have some special ongoing programs for social housing. We have the objective to get about 50,000 units by the year 2030. We only have up to date realized like 10,000. But the list of the people who are in need of social houses is like 250,000 households. So you see, the first thing that we are thinking about is to master the land reserves first. We need land. I mean, we have a program, but we don't have adequate pieces of land to get these social houses built in the appropriate, of course, needed places. The second thing is to improve, like I said, the public transportation. And the third thing is to work more on the regulation and to control building violation in terms of maybe not building in informal housing, and especially speculations. One of the colleagues said that people in the age of 20 to 29 still living in their family houses. It's a reality in Tunisia, and even some families get to build the first and the second floor for their married children. So in Tunisia, we're trying to get solution in the family, but still the government is very, very involved with the housing needs of every social category. And the dilemma in Tunisia is that we have 3.3 million houses for 2.7 million households, but still only 76% of the households own their own houses. So some of them have two and more, and some don't have any house. The second thing, or the most important thing that the Tunisian government needs to work on, is rental regulation. We don't have any rental regulation in Tunisia. Everybody is renting for everybody. So you set the price, it's free, etc. So even those who have to rent a house, it's still very expensive comparing to an average salary in Tunisia. I don't want to be long. I share all your ideas. Thank you, everybody. I didn't go by my presentation. It's just some thoughts that come up from what everybody shared and from the presentation, of course. And we're trying to work much more on the more involvement of the public state real estate agencies. They are still there, but their share of the housing market is only 5%, which is very, very low. And of course, the public agencies are selling for much less price than the private ones. Thank you. It was a pleasure to meet all of you and to share this with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Very interesting thoughts indeed. We need land, you said.
Yes.
We need land.
Yes.
Okay, so you don't have adequate pieces of land in your country. I guess this is you have lack of planning in that sense. Is there for a lack of planning?
Yes, it's mostly about the lack of planning. It's mostly about inequality in the work opportunities. All work opportunities are around the capital, and that's why we have like maybe 30% of the population around the bigger Tunis. Like it's exactly that. 30% of Tunisians are living in the bigger Tunis. So more stress is being operated in the neighborhoods of Tunis and maybe Cypress, the next big city in Tunisia. But the otherwise, everything have a nice house in small cities and stuff. The problem is not as important as especially the capital. The capital is the center of all maybe human needs for social housing. And most of social housing projects, when I talked about 10,000, maybe half of them are around the capital.
Yeah, I think you raise a very interesting point, which is the territorial imbalances, inequalities that we have in several regions around the Mediterranean countries. I think it's, as I said before, it's not only about doing housing, it's about planning the land, it's trying to have in mind the whole country as itself and try to balance the territories. Otherwise, these speculative processes are happening and very fast, and probably we from our public responsibilities are not capable to deal with that. I think it's a very interesting thought, and thank you very much for your contribution. So let's move to our next panelist, Mr. Gregor Gadia. He is a representative from the European Investment Bank. Gregor, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yes, hello. I need to ask the moderator to switch on my video.
Okay, we'll be switching on your video very shortly. Okay. We can see you now.
Very good, excellent. Opportunity to speak to this very interesting group of panelists and participants. And I prepared a very short presentation, but actually everything I wanted to talk about has been said by other panelists, so I just don't want to be repetitive, and maybe I will just skip those slides. What I'd like to say is that we at the EIB are very much sharing the same ideas and understanding of the role of social housing and affordable housing as those opinions and those examples that have been expressed earlier today. And it was very interesting to hear those presentations that gave us a very holistic vision of how social housing should be organized and what it should do for the people. So we at the EIB very much stand behind all those ideals and all those goals. Especially, I'd like to mention one thing which is very dear to this particular geographical area that we are talking about, the Mediterranean. Professor Cicluna had made a very good point at the beginning in her opening remarks about the necessity to adjust the housing projects to the need, traditions of the society and the culture, which is also very much dictated by the climate, by the weather conditions. In my mind, if we are able to really do this, to adapt our housing projects to the culture of the society that we are supporting, we will not only create better lives for the people, but also we will be able to use natural solutions instead of energy to solve the needs of housing. So in countries where we have a lot of rain, we need one type of solution to cope with all this water. And with countries with a lot of sunshine, we need another solution to cope with the sunshine and the resulting overheating problems. So that was something that I like very much, and we at the EIB are trying to support it as much as we can. Those natural solutions in housing is something I believe will be developing more and more in coming years. Now, to say briefly about the EIB, the European Investment Bank is one of the largest lenders to public housing projects in the world. In Europe, there is only two institutions that are doing this of the international finance institutions. It's the Council of Europe Development Bank and us. And we have lent over the last 15 years over 18 billion euros to social and affordable housing projects all over European Union. And we even had some housing projects outside of the EU. But our main region of activity is European Union. And the housing projects we finance are almost entirely those projects that we discussed today, projects that aims at offering housing in a smart way. So good location, good social mix, good quality of construction, uh, usage of new technologies for energy efficiency, and very often the projects that we finance have also tenants involved in decision making of those housing entities they are located. This is in many countries standard that tenants are involved, and we would like to see this happening elsewhere in Europe. So by financing these projects, we are developing, we are actually delivering very good support to the European Union ideals of social inclusion, and we are satisfying the requirement of housing as a basic human right. Of course, we can only do as much as the projects that come our way, and we know that our financing is just a drop in a bucket. So we are also able, to some extent, to be involved in preparation of projects. So we are looking forward not only to finance ready projects, but we are also able to work with potential clients like Cyprus, like Malta, like Tunisia, in developing projects from the phase of an idea to something much more tangible, which is basically ready to be financed and built. So so we are very much here to support those projects. And I would like to say in the end of my little speech that we are looking forward to working with anybody from the European Union and all the neighboring Mediterranean countries on social and affordable housing. We are open and we are very much interested to support you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gregor, for your short and very clear presentation or statement. Thank you. I think as the largest lenders of public housing in the world, you probably will have some questions after the presentations. Probably somebody will be interested. I think it's very interesting what you said about nature-based solutions in housing, by the way. And this depends on geographical context, of course, but I think this should be something that we have in mind for the next how to face climate change by improving the efficiency and the capability of our dwellings and our housing policies in terms of adaptation and mitigation for the climate change. I think it's very interesting, and it's good that you are having this in mind, probably for a long time right now. so thank you very much for your comments. And I think we are moving to the last panelist, which is Ms. Regine Toussaint, Director of European Law and Internal Market and Competition Affairs de l'Union Sociale pour l'Habitat de la France, of France. Virginie, are you with us?
Yes, the boring legal manager is with you. I hope you are hearing me well. I would like to thank you for inviting me to take the floor in this session. So Kurt introduce the topic really clearly about social rights, right to housing, and other kind of rules, other type of rules, and market rules. I would like to already, before introduce Union Sociale pour l'Habitat really briefly. So it's the French Social Housing Provider Federation. The French social housing providers in France are representing 4.6 million dwellings of social housing, and it's mainly rented dwellings, but it's also producing social home ownership. It's represented, as my colleague from Paris said, on France in general, not in Paris, 16% of the total stock in France. So the social landlord in France are dedicated operators. This means they are regulated and they have some competencies defined by law. Saying that, we talk about at the beginning the fact that housing rights is not sometimes implemented, even if it's recognized. Of course, to be implemented, this kind of social rights needs some tools, because it's not coming like that on the market. And one of the tools is, of course, we heard about allocation, social allowances, but of course, the other way is also to promote a dedicated sector to produce dedicated homes. So social housing in France is defined at national level, but the needs are defined at local level. So you were talking also, Matt, about good governance. It's really a necessity to have a dialogue between the main regulators, but also the needs at local ground to be able to answer really closely to the basic need and the ground needs. Saying that, of course, we need to talk about what is not the nice talking. It's about EU competition law, because Kurt introduced this tension between the fact that sometimes conflicting rights and freedom could appear on a specific topic, and housing policies are illustrating this conflict between freedom and rights to be implemented. Of course, may I remind that as a French social landlord, we are obliged to apply also a common rules, which is the European Treaty. And in the European Treaty, there's a set of rules and freedom and principle. Knowing that, we also all know that even if social rights are recognized, European Union today has no competence of social rights implementation. This means, as it's a body with dedicated competencies, their main power to regulate is on competition and internal market. So that's why it's creating sometimes a tension between housing policies, which are not under the EU competencies, but also other rules that are fully in the hands of Europe. Concerning the competition law, as social landlord, we are considered as enterprise on the European market. But the problem is we are dedicated operators. So we could be seen as first sight of an operator who can create some distortion on competition because we are not acting freely as the others. But as said, as first sight, because of course, even if we can create some distortion on competition of the market, we are also providing social cohesion, which is also underlined and a principle which it should be delivered by European Union. So that's why our daily job to be able to continue to provide yearly more than 100,000 dwellings in France in social housing is try to find a balance between our obligation as an economical operator under EU rules and our task on the to deliver right to housing and social mix. So it's really to find a balance. So how can it work concretely for us? It's the use of SGI principles, services of general interest rules, because as I explained before, EU put in place many rules to organize a free market with no distortion of competition. As we are regulated operators, we are disturbed with both competition rules, including when we are receiving some public money, some stated, as it is called in the treaty. So how we can continue to receive stated at European level and continue to be in line with the regulation that we have to follow. I was talking about services of general interest because it's one of the mission who are existing in the treaty, which are enable derogation, exemption, exception to the rules. So Court presented also in his also some piece of what is the Commission position and so on the definition of social housing. In the famous Dutch case, it's really a saga in our sector, what is the definition or not. We should say that we are really pleased about the court ruling on this specific case in Netherlands, to remind that the definition of a general mission is still in the need of the public authorities. Because as I said before, as social needs are mainly, and housing needs are mainly at local level, and the kind of operators I represent are dedicated and regulated, the public authorities need to continue to have the freedom to exercise their competence on defining what is a public task, what is a public need, what is a general interest need. So the court ruling on Dutch case is really clear about the fact that this competence is still in public authorities. Of course, the details are in the tables, and of course, to be able to exercise this freedom, there are sometimes limits. And the limits is the fact that when you are defining a general interest mission, you need to be precise. And in social housing, you need also to have a definition linked to the beneficiaries. This is the two key elements that requires the European Court of Justice to try to find a balance between housing policies, housing rights, and also European rules and internal market and competition. In these two key elements, in France, we decided to implement a dedicated decision to stated laws to social housing landlords in order to be able to continue to receiving stated support to conduct our mission. It requires, of course, from national authorities or locality authorities to implement this kind of derogation rules coming from EU competition law. So, of course, it's not sometimes easy because you have to fulfill criteria. But when you are playing the game, in a way, you can find a balance between also legal certainty for your operators who are in charge of a general interest mission, but also a derogation to the rules who can be a limitation to this housing right implementation. So on the implementation ground, I have to say that there are existing some tools at European level to help us to accomplish a dedicated mission when it's clearly defined. So there is a decision specific on state aid for social housing, but there's also other kind of decision that can help public and local authorities to define the best support they would like to provide to manage a really clear and efficient housing policy. We are talking here about competition, but we can also talking about internal market rules with exemption for social housing in Services Directive. We can also talk about derogation in free movement of capital. For example, the court already consider that the freedom to invest in secondary tourism house could be limited in order to let people who are on the tourism area to continue to live there, to work there. So, of course, it's not at the same level of the freedom of movement or the competition law, but there are possible derogation and exemption in order to continue to implement housing policies. So this is what I mainly wanted to say. Of course, to develop this kind of policies, public authorities have a wide range of tools as a dedicated sector, but also as housing allowances, but also dedicated finance for everyone, and so on and so on. But if, of course, we need a clear and certain framework in order to work, I have to say that this morning I didn't hear much about it, but we also need money. And I know it's not really nice to say, but in order to make rights effective, sometimes money needs to be put on the table.
Thank you very much, Virginie, for your intervention. Thank you for shedding a light into the impact of the court ruling on the Dutch case, especially in the French framework. I think, it's good to know that we are more or less at the first presentation by Kurt. We are like finishing the loop, and we are underlining these tensions and this collision of rights, how to find the balance between a fundamental right, which is housing, and free competence. So thank you very much. I think we are a little bit out of time, but I'm aware that we have a question from Malta. So
yes, Mark, thank you.
We can move to the table. Okay, Charlie.
Thanks, Mark. Yes, we have a question from the Head of Secretariat from the Ministry for Social Accommodation, Mr. Matthew Sarafa.
Hi, good afternoon. My question is, from your experience, how can the government facilitate a practical solution to ensure the right balance between both the public and the private sector in the right amount of having the right amount of housing development, and also ensuring the right percentage of both social and affordable rents versus that of the private sector? Thank you,
Mr. Sarafa. I believe, thank you. I believe Mr. Sarafa can answer the question.
Yes,
Mr. Sherry.
Yes, I can try and take the question. With regard to the first part on the right amount of new housing, it very much depends on for whom you're building. So it's also related to whether you're going to adopt a residualist approach and building only for the lower income categories, or whether you're going to expand and broaden your plan to encompass as well the middle income categories. So with regard to amount, the first question to ask is for whom? And then the second question, as I think Javier Buron made reference to in his presentation earlier this morning, is with whom you are building. So is the state building by itself? Is it privatizing the enterprise, or is it going to work in partnership with the private sector? What counts is that at least, I mean, there is development. So this is something that I tried to underline in my presentation, is that the privatization of housing supply does not work, and that is now proven, except in very exceptional circumstances. With regard to the right percentage of social rents against private rent, when talking in relation to affordability, one must keep in mind the wages. So once again, I mean, what government must cater for is the difference between the wage limit and the market prices in property, whether we're speaking about properties offered for sale or for rental. And once again, the question is, who do we want to help? So do we want to help the lower income categories, or do we want to help as well the middle income categories? Leading us to the question of affordability, it all depends and boils down to Virginie's concluding comment on the available amount of funding which government dedicates to the question of housing.
Thank you. I believe the question has been answered. And thank you, Mr. Sherry. Thank you, Mr. Sarava, for the question. Mark, I don't know whether you would like to put in your last concluding remarks. And thank you so much for moderating this session.
It's been a pleasure. Yes, I think we are running quite out of time, so I will try to be very, very short, which is a little bit unfair because we had plenty of very nice presentations. But let me just underline like very, very few concepts. First of all, we understood that there's a short margin of appreciation when it comes to housing policies, especially in the European countries where the European court rulings have a deep impact on policies. So it's difficult to try to find the balance between the laws of competition and the right to housing, which I think we all agree it's a fundamental social right that we should preserve and provide to people. I think another very interesting insight is that, well, in order to provide a good social housing policy, we need planning, we need money, and we need an overall vision. And this is not always easy. Of course, there's a lack of money. We have a lack of investment on social housing. So the commitment of countries should be even higher than actually it is right now. But we know that as well we need land, we need planning, we need to understand that housing is not only building dwellings, it's undertaking the climate change, the territorial inequalities, and is about building livable spaces. So we have to have this in mind as well. And I think more or less that's all. So let's leave it here. And thank you very much to all the panelists for being with us. And thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you, Mark, for your insightful concluding comments. Thank you all for having the space where we could reflect. This workshop was organized by the Ministry for Social Accommodation, Malta, in cooperation with United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, UNECE, Housing Europe, UN Habitats, and Union for the Mediterranean within the initiative Housing 2030, Improving Housing Affordability in the UNECE region. It was a great opportunity to have the space to debate and discuss further issues related to affordability with various experts from various countries. We look forward to further discussion in the near future. Thank you.